America's unprecedented growth throughout the 20th century brought great prosperity. But it also brought environmental hazards as the byproducts of growth took their toll on fragile ecosystems. By the late 1960s, Americans began paying more attention to the environmental impact of pollution from industry and automobiles, from solid waste, hazardous materials, and a burgeoning population. In 1970, Congress adopted the nation's first comprehensive clean air legislation, and the Environmental Protection Agency was created to set air quality standards and monitor their attainment. In 1977, the Act was revised to strengthen regulatory provisions and to enhance EPA's authority. By the mid-1980s, great strides have been made in limiting additional sources of pollution. Still, there remained over 100 urban areas with a total population of over 100 million people where air quality standards were considered unhealthful. As new data emerged regarding additional sources of pollution, and as scandals at EPA raised questions about the agency's vigilance, it was apparent to most in Washington that new legislation would be needed to achieve improved air quality. Political infighting, divided government, and rising costs associated with pollution control made additional changes particularly difficult to achieve.
The period from 1981 to 1988 was a particularly difficult one because the Reagan administration was opposed to what they viewed as excessive regulation, burdensome regulation, and intrusive bureaucracy. They were cutting the budgets of major regulatory agencies, the EPA being a major target of those cutbacks. So we had an EPA with a reduced budget, with reduced staff, with loss of some of the most experienced people, less money to grant to the states to help them implement the law. And you had in Congress an extended period of 13 years in which there could be no agreement on how to amend what is in effect the nation's most important environmental statute. Some people, including myself, have written about environmental gridlock in Congress, where environmentalists were now well represented in Washington. So was industry. The sides were so evenly matched and well represented in Congress by those members of Congress sympathetic to environmentalists on the one hand, or as in the case of John Dingell, chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, quite sympathetic to the auto industry and its concerns. The result of all that was, in brief, extended period of disagreement, lack of consensus.
What was different in 1990, and the major reason why we were finally able to break the logjam, I say, it was due to two men, primarily, whose first names were George. George Mitchell, who had worked on this issue for over a decade, became the majority leader of the Senate. And George Mitchell was determined as majority leader to finally get clean air legislation passed. And the other George was George Bush, who became President of the United States, decided for a number of different reasons that clean air was something that we ought to deal with and pass, and he put it high on the legislative agenda.
The extensive 1990 Clean Air Act legislation targets three major environmental problems, one of which is acid rain.
The acid rain problem primarily affected the Northeast all the way up into Canada, but it has started to become a problem all over the country. The major source of acid rain pollution was coming from the Midwest power plants. The Midwest power plants that were in existence didn't meet a tight standard, or any standard for that matter, to reduce the sulfur emissions. Another new problem, which is very new and very frightening, is the deterioration of the upper ozone layer over our planet. At first, scientists questioned whether it was valid or not, and they argued the various theories, and maybe it was an aberration, etc. But the science developed very quickly that the ozone layer was deteriorating, primarily from chemicals called chlorofluorocarbons. And the chlorofluorocarbons were reacting in the upper ozone layer to make, at first, what was a hole around Antarctica, but a thinning elsewhere as well. And the consequence of that is that ultraviolet light gets through, which was otherwise blocked, causing large amounts of skin cancer, and subtle changes to the ecosystem, the full consequences of which we still don't have a full knowledge. So we wanted to deal with that problem. And then the last problem that we hope to deal with in this clean air law deals with something that had potentially been addressed in the 1970 law, but in fact had not been dealt with by the Environmental Protection Agency, and that was the problem of toxic air pollutants. The kind of pollutants that come from some of these factories, especially the chemical factories, that are a threat to the people in the surrounding communities. These toxic, meaning poisonous air pollutants, cause cancer, birth defects, and neurological damage. And in fact, when our subcommittee went out to the Kanawha Valley of West Virginia, we were hearing testimony that was quite shocking. The cancer rates were twice the rate of the nation. There were people who told us about the fact that they had to sleep on an incline for fear, one man told us particularly, he had to sleep on an incline for fear that he would drown in the fluids in his lungs.
As with all legislation, the Clean Air Act of 1990 is not self-implementing. Making an act of Congress work is sometimes a long and difficult process. In the case of the Clean Air Act of 1990, implementation will not be complete until the next decade.
Students of American government, and certainly the public at large, is under the impression that when Congress passes a law, that's it. So the next day, everything is taken care of. And of course, serious students of American government know this is not at all the case. We rely on the federal bureaucracy to take an act of Congress, to interpret it where it may be vague, and more particularly to develop the detailed regulations that will call upon industry and private individuals, everything from public utilities to the auto industry. Will tell them what they need to do to be in compliance with the act, and therefore to help bring about the improvement in air quality that, after all, Congress is trying to achieve.
The principal job of implementing the provisions of the Clean Air Act rests with the Environmental Protection Agency, a regulatory agency created in 1970 to monitor air and water quality and to enforce environmental statutes. The process of implementation begins with EPA staff generating specific rules from the often vague goals of legislation.
In the first 2 years of the Clean Air Act, we estimate that we will have to issue over 55 major regulations to implement its various provisions and a whole host of related documents and materials. So the translation of a law, even one as detailed as the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, requires a tremendous amount of effort on the part of a large number of people at EPA and ultimately in state and local government agencies, because the way the Clean Air Act works, much of the actual implementation is done through state and local agencies.
Developing regulations to enforce an act like the Clean Air Act of 1990 requires that we determine the threat to public health and to the environment. Bureaucracies increasingly use methods such as risk assessment to determine the nature of that threat or risk to public health and to environmental quality. It might turn on the danger of acid rain to aquatic systems. More frequently with the Clean Air Act, the question is the degree to which public health is affected by air pollutants, such as toxic chemicals in the air or ozone. And once we know about the relationship between the level of air pollution and public health, we can determine the appropriate level of air quality that should be achieved under the Act. So this is partly a scientific process involving measurements of air pollution and determination of the likely public health effects. It's also, though, very much a political process. The process of implementation begins with the EPA going section by section through the Act and developing regulations after, again, review of the scientific evidence, the economics, consulting with significant parties. At that point, there are some changes now in the way the implementation process works compared to the pre-Reagan years. In particular, in earlier years, the EPA would have developed a regulation and issued a proposed regulation, published it in the Federal Register, and asked for public comment. Following the receipt of public comment, they would have issued a revised regulation and published it. And then those who were unhappy with it would go to court to challenge the final regulation. All of this was done in open. All of it was public. It did, however, result in quite a bit of litigation. Indeed, the EPA acknowledges that something like 80% of its regulations were challenged in court, either by industry or by environmentalists or both. The new process is different in several ways. There was an executive order issued by the Reagan administration in February 1981. That's Executive Order 12291, which is still in effect in the Bush administration. That regulation provides that prior to publication in the Federal Register, a proposed regulation, at least a major proposed regulation, would first receive some scrutiny by the Office of Management and Budget, which has a regulatory affairs office that does this. And in addition, before the final regulation is published in the Federal Register, there would be another review by the White House, by the Office of Management and Budget.
Many actors play a role in the implementation process. Among them are representatives of numerous interest groups who have a stake in the final outcome of rulemaking. In the case of clean air legislation, many diverse industry and environmental groups closely monitor the work of the EPA.
As the trade association for the investor-owned electric utility industry, we represent about 180 electric utility companies. Those companies generate about 3/4 of all the electricity in the United States and serve about 80% of all the customers in the United States. So we have a large portion of the electric industry. As such, we have a tremendous amount of data that we collect every year. Facts on boiler operation, power plant operation, how much electricity do we actually make, how much does the country use, those kinds of things. And that kind of information is very helpful to the EPA in trying to fashion workable regulations.
The National Clean Air Coalition was founded in 1970. It now has over 50 organizations. The environmental organizations include groups like the Sierra Club, Friends of the Earth, Natural Resources Defense Council. It has public health groups like the American Lung Association, which I represent. It has labor organizations like the United Steelworkers of America. We have church groups like the United Church of Christ. We have garden clubs. It's a very broad-based coalition. We have always had access to the agency when we've wanted it. The American Lung Association for years, for example, has sponsored Clean Air Week. And the theme of the week is that it takes industry, government, and citizens working together to solve the problems of air pollution. And I think the agency does make an effort to work at that partnership and to listen, and within the requirements of the law, do its best.
For many years, the role of interest groups was largely limited to challenging EPA rules in court. This was an expensive and time-consuming process. Recently, EPA and other regulatory agencies have attempted to bring interest groups into the rulemaking process early in an effort to forge consensus on the rules before they are issued, a process known as regulatory negotiation, or in bureaucratic jargon, RegNeg.
The process of regulatory negotiation has come about did come about in the late 1980s and is used now in the 1990s, in part because of the concerns that have developed about regulation, both environmental regulation and other forms of regulatory policy, since the late 1970s. That is, there have been concerns for some time about the cost of regulation, the burden of regulation, the process we use to develop these rules. It's a way of avoiding litigation, expensive litigation, avoiding delays. It is reflective of the frustration felt, particularly in the business community and I suppose in the Republican administration, to the traditional approach to regulation. There have been lots of complaints about the so-called command and control approach to regulation, about the cost, about the burden on industry. Now, this is an approach to regulation that says, let's sit around a table, let's talk about the issues, let's see if we can't reach some consensus. It may still take 6 months or a year or several years to do that, but that's still preferable in the eyes of many students of environmental policy.
Regulatory negotiation is credited with breaking the logjam over the issue of acid rain. Acid rain is an environmental hazard thought to be created in large part by power plant emissions in the Midwest that burn coal with high levels of sulfur dioxide.
Each utility plant in the United States, every single plant, will be given a certain number of allowances. They will be allowed to emit a certain amount of SO2. They can never exceed that each and every year. Now, they don't have to meet that limit. They can be lower than that. if they're given an amount of, say, 6,000, and in reality, over the space of the calendar year, they only emit 5,000, then they have 1,000 allowances, or 1,000 tons of SO2, that they can do several things with. They can put it in a bank, much like we put money in a bank, to be used later, checking accounts, saving accounts, things like that. So you can bank them. You can trade them. That means you can give them away to another utility industry or to another industry as a way of enticing them to come into your area for economic growth and for jobs. You can lease them. You can give them away for a certain number of years and then take them back if there are any left. You can make arrangements for that. Or you can just flat sell them. You can sell them to people who need allowances for some reason. Now, perhaps the reason they need allowances is for them to reduce their SO2 emissions would cost $1,000 a ton. If you sell it to them for $700 a ton, they are still spending $700, but they're not spending the $1,000, so that increment of $300 is reflected in a cost savings for compliance to the customer.
Congress and the White House continue to act as major players in the implementation process. Congress plays a particularly important role through its oversight function.
I think that Congress has a tremendous responsibility, not just to pass laws, which is the way people usually think that Congress acts. Congress passes a law, the president signs it, and we have laws. But Congress has to make sure those laws are working, make sure that the oversight responsibilities of the Congress are being fulfilled. And so when we hold hearings and continue to monitor how the laws are working and whether the job is being done by those who are empowered to enforce the law, that may be more important in many cases than passing another law that may not be enforced, or if it's enforced, may not live up to what we expect it to do. So we have a constitutional responsibility to watch to see how laws are working, not just to think of new ideas for new laws.
We have seen in the case of the experience we've had with it that it's saved many millions of dollars and has still achieved the same net reduction in pollution.
I fear that it's going to cost millions of dollars to pay for it out of human health, because they're going to, if this theory doesn't work out correctly, we're going to find there's going to be more pollution rather than less pollution.
There's no question that the role of congressional oversight is one that is taken very seriously by many of the committees and subcommittees on the Hill. We go through extensive hearings and reviews of the work that we do, and in many cases those hearings can become fairly antagonistic. You don't get a lot of publicity for telling the agency they've done a good job. So clearly, for people who believe they found problems with our implementation, it makes for a lot more interesting hearing. It does consume a lot of agency time and attention, but on the other hand, I think it does continue to put pressure on the agency to open up its decision-making processes.
Each administration also seeks to exercise some control over the implementation process. The Bush administration created a controversial agency known as the Council on Competitiveness to review the economic impact of regulatory rules before they are set in place.
The President asked the Vice President to set up a review body to review all regulations in the government, but in particular look at the clean air regulations to make sure that they were done to fully protect the environment, get all of the clean air savings that we had, but at the same time make sure we don't impose additional costs onto businesses and ultimately the economy and jobs. The process is essentially the Council deliberates when there's a policy question where people have a disagreement at the staff level. And the Vice President tries to build consensus, so he will bring in all the players and ask them to present their views, try to get everyone to agree with a common position, maybe a compromise, it may be one position or the other, and have the meeting conclude with everyone in agreement that that's what should be done. Then the person who's responsible goes out and does that. If there's still a disagreement, the Vice President will sometimes say, well, I've heard your views, there doesn't look like there's a consensus now, let me take this under advisement and I'll get back to you individually. if somebody really didn't like what the council was doing, they could always ask the president to review it. But the vice president meets with the president regularly, makes sure that he tells the president what it is that's on the council agenda so that it's reflecting the president's views.
Council on Competitiveness is not set up by law the way EPA is. They're not required to hear arguments from all the different forces in society that have a stake in this or have knowledge about it. They don't have people with expertise about it. The Council on Competitiveness is like a secret government. It meets out of the public view. Who appears before them or who talks to them is not on any kind of docket. As far as we know, Vice President Quayle and some of his staff could be meeting with industry people at the country club and never talk to environmentalists, and we wouldn't know one way or the other.
You've got people who may have lost out in the compromise in the Clean Air on some of their provisions. Representative Waxman, for example, wanted much more stringent controls than what Congress ultimately agreed to. And he doesn't like it when the council says, we're not going beyond what Congress said in the act, we're going to cut the costs of this. That's at the substantive level. I think it's important to know that because I think that's what's driving a lot of these complaints. And what the Vice President always emphasizes is that these regulatory matters are about jobs, job creation. They're about choices for products for consumers. They're about small businesses, whether or not we have taxes that are increased in order to pay for these regulations. And there's a large series of questions that don't get addressed when it's framed as an environmental issue or a health issue that have to be addressed in the regulatory process.
The scrubber that goes on the utility, the catalytic converter that goes on the automobile, all of the refinements in petrochemical kinds of activities create jobs because someone has to develop the control technology, someone has to make it, someone has to install it, someone has to maintain it. These are jobs. And so the idea that if we control air pollution, we are no longer competitive is a false argument. And the idea that Vice President Quayle is watching out for American companies, the Japanese have no problems making a car that meets EPA's requirements. So I don't understand the need for a competitive council.
When the 1990 Clean Air Act is fully implemented early in the next century, how much progress can we anticipate in improving air quality?
We estimate that when we fully implemented the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, we will have reduced the amount of air pollutants being emitted into the atmosphere of the United States by about 56 billion pounds annually. That translates into improved air quality really across the country. Over 100 million people that are currently living in areas where EPA believes the air is unhealthy will be living in areas where those air quality problems have largely, if not totally, been solved. We also expect that our acid rain emissions will have been cut by over 10 million tons a year, which is roughly a 40 to 50% reduction in those pollutants. We will also have made a major reduction in the emissions of toxic air pollutants from industries across the country. And I think if we have not solved the problem, we will have certainly taken a major bite out of it.
In the year 2000, I would hazard a guess we'll be halfway there. That's optimistic. That's doing the job that the citizen watchdog has to do. That's sitting on the agency's back. That's harping to the media. That's harping to Congress. That's getting people involved. But I do not believe that most Americans will have clean and healthful air at the end of the century.
Ultimately, public opinion will help determine environmental quality. As the cost of cleaning the environment increase, and as the public is asked to make substantial changes in lifestyle, how much support will clean air implementation garner?
One of the big questions always was, when you did public opinion research and polling, would you pay more for cleaner air? The answer is yes. Unquestionably, 90-something% yes. How much more would you pay? Would you pay $10 a month more? Yes. Would you pay $20 a month more? The number started to come down, but still primarily yes. Would you pay $50 a month more just for cleaner air, not how much cleaner or anything else? The numbers start to fall away dramatically.
But time and time again, every time you ask the American public, are they willing to pay for a clean environment? The answer is yes. And I think the concern is not knowing what the future looks like. If we can make the changes today, let's make them, because we're worried about our children. We're worried about the environment they're going to live in.
Industry and other critics of environmental policy have often questioned the extent to which the public is genuinely supportive of environmental regulations. They're expensive. Increasingly, they may prove to be inconvenient for people. When major urban areas have to begin changing transportation policy, mandating carpooling, restricting individuals' ability to use appliances, and particularly automobiles that they're accustomed to using, it would be a real test of how far the American public is willing to go in pursuit of environmental quality.